Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Adventures in .NET episode. I'm Sean Claybo, your host, and with me today is your other host, Caleb Wells from... Where are you from, Caleb?
Typhon Group. Hey, y'all.
Typhon Group, right?
Yes.
Yes. And also with me on the panel is Charles McWood. Say hi, Charles.
Hey, I'm just going to throw in here, too. I just found out that I was accepted as an expert speaker / podcaster at Ignite. So if you're going to be there, come find me.
Awesome.
I saw that. What are you going to talk about?
So I'm going to do a Ruby Rogues episode on containerizing your Rails apps. And then I'm going to do a Views on Vue episode on using serverless with Vue. So
Sweet. At a Microsoft conference. Awesome.
Looking forward to it.
All right. And our awesome guest today is Filip Ekberg. He's a Microsoft MVP and a Pluralsight author. I want to say hi, Filip.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things that I have as a goal for devchat.tv is to cover technologies that are up and coming, things that we're probably going to have to deal with on a more regular basis in the future. Some of these include AI, VR, and one of them is blockchain. So I reached out to one of the experts that I knew, Gregory McCubbin, and we pulled together a few other people, and we've started a podcast called Adventures in Blockchain. So if you're looking at blockchain as something that you may want to work in, something that you're curious about learning more about, or something that you just want to keep current on until you have the opportunity to make a career jump and go over and work in blockchain and crypto, then definitely check out Adventures in Blockchain. You can find it at adventuresinblockchain.io.
So I think we're going to cover a number of topics today. So Filip, you do a lot of things. Where do you think we should start?
You know, I've primarily worked with C# and .NET for the past few years, and there's some really interesting things happening in the C# ecosystem or the C# world. You know, we've got this great version of C# coming up, which is C# 8. It's just around the corner. There's some really interesting features coming to the language, and even if you've done C# for a long time, I think there's going to be a few things in there for you that you're really going to be liking your applications.
Great. So I understand you've done talks at NDC over the last few years around .NET, and you work both in the web and the mobile space.
That's correct, yeah. So I've done everything from, the old ASP.NET web forums, and I've done classic ASP as well, and then I've done Xamarin and doing native development as well. So I'm trying to get my hands in every type of different type of programming environment. So learning all the cool things about different programming languages, but my love has always been in C#.
Cool. I think your talk at NDC a couple of years ago was around tasks and async await. I know that's changed a lot, since I started developing 15 or so years ago.
Yep.
Right. And it's, as C# tends to do, it simplifies what you have to do and then just hides the complexity, or handles it for you to a certain extent. So if you're okay, I think that's a good place to start, is talking about the evolution of running tasks, multi-threading, async await, how it's used inside of the framework.
Yeah. So, as you said, over the years, there's been a lot of changes as to how you work with asynchronous programming in your applications, especially if you're coming from an older type of application development. You're probably familiar with background workers and creating and spawning threads yourself, but you also know that it gets pretty hard managing that in your applications. So the task parallel library that was introduced in, I believe it was .NET 4.5, really changed the way that we look at multi-threading in our applications, because we no longer have to think about the particular task or the particular thread that we're creating. We have this system in .NET that just handles everything for us. So the idea is that we say, I want to shoot off this work and run this somewhere. I don't really care if you create a new thread or if you create multiple threads or how you divide up this work. Just solve it for me. And then we have things in this task parallel library as well with the parallel extensions that allows us to work really effectively with different types of asynchronous and parallel approaches. Mm-hmm. It's also something that's continuing to be evolved throughout the language. So recently we've had this async and await keywords being introduced in the language that evolves the way that you work with the tasks even more. So it allows you to take this pretty difficult topic, and when they introduce a task, they make it a little bit easier, and then use async and await, and it becomes so easy that it's easier for you to make mistakes in your applications, if that makes sense.
It's a little too easy.
It's a little too easy. The API is so good that it's really hard to understand exactly the way that it works.
So one of the things that I've run into, and Sean may be able to relate to this, is right, with async and await, you're no longer managing the task yourself. I mean, it's still a task of action result or whatever, right? And so you don't necessarily need to know the inner workings or how it's working in the background, right? And I've seen this a lot where you'll have an async task but no await, and it'll run and it'll do its thing because it's not absolutely required, but that's not actually asynchronous, right?
Correct, right. So just applying the async keyword to a method doesn't magically make the method asynchronous. So I tend to use that as an example when I show off how async and await works. You simply take an application that's running something that takes a long time and might be blocking up your UI. You apply the async keyword and it just still behaves the same way. When you apply the async keyword, what it's really doing is that it's taking your entire method and moving that into another method, so to speak, or some classes that's being generated as well. That's a way to oversimplify it, right? But it's still running synchronously. It's still just running on the same thread that it did earlier. Now, where the magic happens is when you couple this together with the await keyword. So when you have the task, the async keyword, and the await keyword in the same method, that's where the magic happens.
So I want to step back a little bit and really, when should a developer look at using async await, and when are they just okay to not use that? You know, what circumstances would they want to make that switch over? You know, I've been using it for a while with database calls and APIs and things like that. But, you know, to be honest, I may or may not be getting a benefit out of it.
Sure. So it's interesting because there's been this drive over the years to async everything, which means that every API that's available in every NuGet package that you find, they want to have an async API to allow you to work with all the methods asynchronously. But in some cases, it doesn't make any sense. And in some applications, like a console application or a Windows service, you might not really benefit that much from using the asynchronous approaches. So where you see the most benefit of using async and await and the task parallel library is, I would say, in applications that have a UI. So if you're building WPF applications or if you're working in Xamarin, you're really going to benefit from these APIs. And then, of course, as well, if you're working in ASP.NET, it's a little bit different because you don't have the UI at the server side, right? So one of the misconceptions with async in ASP.NET is that when you mark your method as async, the client side will be async. But that's in fact not what's going to happen. What's happening is that you relieve the server of some work to allow it to take other requests as it's waiting for whatever asynchronous operation it's waiting for.
Yeah, it doesn't do AJAX for the front end and the back end, which makes sense, right? Applications that I'm developing lately are Angular front end and C#, middleware back end. And, they're segmented right down the middle, right? One's our web app and one's our API. And while they talk to each other and they're dependent, you're not necessarily going to get the benefits of one and the other. I mean, they can make each other faster, but it doesn't carry over.
Yeah. So what's really interesting with this is if you're a full stack developer, which I think most people strive to be full stack developers, and that's one of the coolest titles you can have right now, and it's something that everyone's looking for.
Right.
That means that you need to understand async and await in JavaScript on the client side if you're working in Angular or whatever framework you work in.
Right.
And you need to understand the state machine and how everything works on the client side, as well as then understanding how async and await works on the server side.
It's interesting, and I don't want to get too far on a tangent, but one of my coworkers at Angular, there's multiple ways of handling service calls and managing things. And I lean more towards RxJS and observables, and he actually uses the async and await. It's not promises, but it's different way of doing the observables, I believe. And he uses that because that makes more sense to him, and it's more, I guess, more consistent with how .NET does it. So it's interesting to see the different approaches, even from a TypeScript versus C#, patterns. So,
well,
sure, yeah,
you mentioned that too because in C#, the async and await stuff, like we're talking about, is built in. And if you're talking about Angular in particular, the RxJS stuff is what's built in and kind of first class.
Right.
I think there are trade-offs depending on which environment you're in as well, which you want to use. But if you're super familiar with async and await, I don't see that there's necessarily a downside beyond the fact that the one is, I guess, more fully integrated in certain circumstances than the other.
Yep.
So on the server side, there is some overhead with async await. So are there times where you would just want to just go with a straight synchronous call to something or process instead of going async?
You don't want to spawn off a lot of threads solving a problem on the server side for one request, right? So if you're trying to solve something using, for instance, parallel extensions together with the task parallel library, you want to make sure that you're not throttling your server by just spawning off this farm of threads that solves one little thing for one user. So you have to make sure that you kind of use the correct tools for the job for that particular user. And in some cases, it would be better to just do that synchronously if it's a large chunk of work and just one thread being locked instead of locking every available thread on your system.
What are some of the most common mistakes you see people doing with async and await in C#?
That would for sure be deadlocking applications by using the inappropriate methods like .result or .wait on your tasks. It's okay to use the result property on your task as long as you've properly awaited the task before.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so easy to forget to await the task, and then you run into a deadlock, or your application becomes synchronous, or it blocks the application rather.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the probably most common problems. And as well as marking your methods as async and not using the await keyword in the task inside the method itself. That's probably the two things that I see a lot.
Gotcha.
Now, in ASP.NET, you have to be async all the way up the chain, right? All the way up the stack in your calls. So like I've had some difficulties with like my ASP.web forms applications where some of those methods, at the very top, how do I get that to be as async without using the .result or any like that stuff inside the methods?
Well, if the top level method cannot be asynchronous, there's a way around that you can cheat the state machine to not run into a deadlock. You can wrap it in a new task, which means the state machine will run somewhere else. But most of the time, the idea of running async all the way down boils down to how ASP.NET worked previously. So maybe without involving ASP.NET Core too much, where everything's changed, you should still try to do async all the way to make sure that you don't deadlock or that your everything flows through the application. But if you can't do that, it should be okay to wrap it in a task and call .result to force out a result, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
Without going into too much details on how it works internally.
So, question here, and this goes along with the async all the way down, right? You've got 5 methods, and they're all async. If you put an await inside each one of those, is that actually going to have performance implication versus doing the await once?
It's not only the await keyword, but as soon as you introduce the async keyword, there's going to be changes to your method. So if you use the async and await keyword on all of your methods, it's going to create something called a state machine for each of those methods.
Okay.
That means that it needs to keep track of everything that's happening inside your method. So if the last thing or the only thing that you're doing in your method is doing await your task, you can just as well return the task and remove the await and the async keyword. You just relieve that work to whoever's calling the method instead, because they have to await it as well, right? So you might as well just let them do it. So if you don't need the result in your method, there's no reason for you to use the await keyword.
Okay.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I think I've probably been making that mistake doing async await all the way down my chain.
Yeah, sometimes it's just easier to try and return it. And then if you need the result, you just add the async and the await keyword later on. Mm-hmm. And the contract for that method is still going to be intact, right? Because it's still going to return a task off the same thing. Gotcha.
So you mentioned state machine.
Yep.
Is that something that's been around since the task parallel program, or is that a fairly newer feature with async await? Or is that just another way where they're abstracting away the complexity?
So the state machine was introduced with the async and await keyword, and it's the way that they kind of implement the feature in the language.
Gotcha.
So it's using the task parallel library and task and all of that to achieve this really nice pattern that you can use in your applications with the async and await keywords. So all that it's doing really is it's keeping track of where, if your operation that you're awaiting is finished, and it's keeping track of if there's an exception, it knows where to set that exception and how to handle that properly, as well as how to give you a result back and run your continuation. So it's doing a lot of magic that you don't have to do anymore.
But the idea is you don't want to have numerous state machines running at the same time, especially if they're all trying to achieve the same purpose.
Yeah, sure. You don't want to overuse the async and await keyword, but I will also say that you shouldn't be afraid of using it because it introduces a state machine.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So it's the right amount.
Yes, yeah. And I guess that would differ based on what you're developing for, whether it's desktop or mobile or web.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got an interesting thing happened to me a few years ago now, and I did Xamarin development, and I used async and await because everything's in .NET, right? Everything's in C#. I felt familiar with using the APIs that you do in any other type of app. Mm-hmm. So I applied the async keyword at the wrong place in the Android application, and everything just broke, and I had no idea why. It turned out that it had to return some specific value that it wouldn't do unless my async operation would complete first. But it took a little while, so it didn't return the value back to the OS. So the OS thought that the application crashed. So in some situations, it could be, you need to be cautious about where you add these things, right? Even if it's so easy to add in your apps, you need to try it out a little bit.
Yeah, I guess that follows along with what you said about wait and result is one's waiting on the other and the other is waiting on the one that's waiting on it, and you just get stuck.
Yeah, you get a deadlock.
Yeah, there's no way out. Gotcha.
But what's interesting with that as well is that you could write a test, and the way that your asynchronous operations executing that particular context might not deadlock. But then when you run this in your WPF application, it might deadlock. So even if it doesn't deadlock in one type of app, it could do in another.
Gotcha.
It's a really complex topic.
So in desktop applications and mobile applications, would async await be kind of the preferred way to keep the GUI free and keep it updating? A long time ago, you'd always do events or things like that to keep the GUI fresh and keep going. Is the right way to do it now with the async await?
Yeah, I would say so. So if you apply the normal patterns, you use MVVM in your WPF applications, and then inside your view models, everything is asynchronous, I would say that that's the way to do it. Well, it's my preferred way to do it. There are other ways to achieve the same thing. It's kind of the flavor that you like, but it's a very common approach across different types of applications. So if you use async and await inside your WPF applications, an ASP.NET person might understand your app as well, and that's a benefit of that as well.
One of the things that's gotten me hung up previously is, the requirement for async await, but then feeling that I have to attach that await to some kind of logic or call to the database or something, right? And if I don't necessarily have that, where do I put the await? But it doesn't have to be on a call to the database or a call to service or a call to another method, correct?
That's correct, yeah. So you can spawn off a task by calling, for instance, task.run, and that'll start off a new thread. It'll run your work that you want on that particular thread. You pass a delegate to it or an action, it runs that action somewhere else. And then when this is done, you can get a notification with the state machine and all of that. It tells you that there's a result available, or this method executed properly, or there was an exception, and you can handle that properly. So normally, if you have something that's a little bit slow and you want to shoot that off somewhere else, and you want to use the async and await principles in your applications, you just use task.run, and you wrap your heavy machinery in there.
Okay. Do you know if there are any significant changes in async await between .NET Framework and .NET Core?
I wouldn't say significant, but there's been some changes in how it works in ASP.NET Core.
Okay.
In particular, how the previously, for everything inside ASP.NET, you had to do configure await false to make sure that it didn't grab your entire synchronization context and pass that down.
Okay.
In ASP.NET Core, that's a little bit different. I don't want to go into the details because that's very much a implementation detail, but it's a little bit different. It's a little bit better and works a little bit more like you would expect. That makes sense.
Good. I've seen a number of things like that, a number of incremental changes that they realized were issues in .NET Framework that they integrated into Core. and those little bits and pieces add up, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But most of the things are working in a similar manner as it did earlier.
Yeah.
But if we look at C# 8 and forward, they're introducing things like asynchronous streams, which is a way of working with streams of data. So think of grabbing, for instance, each line in a text file, and you want to process each line as you get that from your disk. Now, normally reading from the disk is pretty fast, but you want to process that. And instead of having to do that in a nasty way, like you can probably think of ways that you can build this.
Yeah.
Instead of coming up with some weird way, you can simply apply the await keyword before the for each loop, where you load each line from disk. So it'll just, it's a little bit more to it, but let's say that you have await for each line in your file, and you can process each line as you get that. That's a stream of data coming from your disk. That's a really nice API, and it's an interesting addition to the language.
Okay. You mentioned C# 8, and I actually wanted to dig into that some. But one thing I want to bring up about async await before I forget is debugging in async await. How do you handle that, right? Because, and I'm sure other people have run into this, Sean as well, right? When you go to debug like an API that's async await, I've got my breakpoints, and the same breakpoint might be hit 3 times, and it may bounce back and forth between methods. How do you handle that? Or do you just kind of ignore it and get to where you need to be to get the data you need?
Well, so I think we end up having the same problem, because I end up having the same issues, right? So it's really hard to debug asynchronous code because it's a complex topic, and it's complex how it works and how it's implemented. But there are some help in Visual Studio, and they're introducing more and more help in, for instance, Visual Studio 2019 has a lot more help. It shows the stack a little bit different when you look at, the call stack. You can see that a little bit different when you debug the application. Okay. They've done improvements over the years, but so I guess the answer is upgrade Visual Studio, and you'll get a little bit more help, but there's no silver bullet.
Right.
Okay, so is there anything that we didn't ask a question about async await that you think would be beneficial for our listeners to know about?
I think we covered everything from the misconceptions of how async and await works to debugging to how the state machine internally works and how it works in different types of applications. I think that's kind of covers all the bases that most developers would want to listen to.
Okay.
One of the biggest pain points that I find as I talk to people about software is deployment. It's really interesting to have the conversations with people where I don't want to deal with Docker. I don't want to deal with Kubernetes. I don't want to deal with setting up servers. I don't, all of these different things. In a lot of ways, DevOps has gotten a lot easier. And in a lot of ways, DevOps has also kind of embraced a certain amount of culture around applications, the way we build them, the way we deploy them. I've really felt for a long time that developers need to have the conversations with DevOps or adopt some form of DevOps so that they can take control of what they're doing and really understand when things go to production, what's going on, so that they can help debug the issues and fix the issues and find the issues when they go wrong and help streamline things and make things better and slicker and easier so that they'll more generally go right. So we started a podcast called Adventures in DevOps, and I pulled in one of the hosts from one of my favorite DevOps shows, Nell Shamrell Harrington from the Food Fight Show, and we got things rolling there. And so this is more or less a continuation of the Food Fight Show, where we're talking about the things that go into DevOps. So if you're struggling with any of these operational type things, then definitely check out Adventures in DevOps. And you can find it at adventuresindevopspodcast.com.
So what about C# 8 is really kind of fascinating and cool that people that haven't, switched over and tried to use that yet, what's coming down the pipe there?
Right. So there's 3 features in C# 8 that are really interesting, and it's language features that they've probably wanted to introduce for a long time, but couldn't since they had an older compiler, and now Roslin's been around for a few years. That's the new .NET compiler platform. Codename was Roslin. So now they're introducing changes to how tuples works, pattern matching, as well as the null reference types. So those are 3 of the major features they're adding, and we can go through them if you want to, and we can talk a little bit more in detail about how they're changing the language.
I think that would be great. I've used tuples, right? Tuples. I have actually used those in certain circumstances.
Yep.
And I've had coworkers look at it and like, what is this? What are you doing? And I'm like, well, I need, 3 different results from this call, but I don't necessarily want one object. Here's a way to do it. And I think I've actually seen how the latest version of the identity example in .NET Core MVC is using a tuple, right?
Yep.
So, can you explain that to our listeners? I think it's a really cool function that they've, like you said, has made a first-class member of C#.
Right. So I just want to emphasize tuples or tuples. I can blame that I'm not native English, so I can call it whatever I want. And
right, yes,
I'm a tuple.
Okay. So the tuples were introduced in C#, one of the C# 7 versions. There was a few points. I can remember which one. What they allow you to do is represent a type without creating the type. So you can say that I have this thing, which is not an anonymous type. It's not a particular class, but it's a container of multiple values. So you can say I have this thing that contains an integer, a string, and whatever you want. And you have this construct of how you express that in your language, right?
Gotcha.
So now we can return something that is not a real type that we've declared in the language. It's not an anonymous type, so we don't have any of those negative impacts. But we have this tuple thing. It's just a container of multiple values. And where it becomes really interesting is when we combine that with pattern matching. And I think that's what we see in, for instance, ASP.NET Core that you mentioned. Some of those things allow you to more easily use pattern matching. And pattern matching is a way for us to look at a given type and figure out what we want to do with it or find out its particular traits. So we could construct a tuple to say, I want to look at a type that has an integer, a string, and a double. And it'll allow us to match on that particular thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense to me. How would you compare them to dynamics? So people who are, it's not an anonymous type, but it's also not a type that's determined at runtime, right? Like a dynamic would be. So it is actually types built into C# or objects that you've created, right? Classes that you've created that you can stack together.
So that's a very good question. Dynamics is something totally different. It evaluates your expression in runtime, and it has a kind of a huge performance impact depending on the system you run it on. Tuples is just a way for you to construct a type, or say that a good example is a method that returns 2 things. Let's say that you return the age and the name of a person. Instead of creating this struct or a class that represents those two values, you can now say that my method returns an int and a string. I can give that int and a string a name, or I can deconstruct that into a local variable when I call the method, right? So this tuple thing, it's not dynamics. It's not an anonymous type. It's not a new class. It's not a new struct. It's just a prettier way of us to create tuples in C#. Because we've been able to use the tuple class previously, but now we have a first class citizen in the language to do that.
And I'll add links to your NDC talks, because I think you go into some good detail and you actually show some examples so people can see what they look like.
Yeah, it's easier when you look at code as well.
Right.
So tuples used to be positional based, if I'm not wrong there. And I think I avoided them because of that kind of a limitation, but that's no longer the case, right?
They are still position based. So that's one of the demos that I show in my NDC talk, that if you call a method, you can still deconstruct that into something that doesn't make any sense. So if you're returning an integer called x and an integer called y, you can call that tuple.x and tuple.y, but when you deconstruct that into your local variable where you're calling the method, you can deconstruct that into a new tuple, and when you do so, it's going to take the first value of what's returned from the tuple and match that into the first one in your new tuple. So it is position-based, as well as allowing you to have names of your fields on your tuples.
Right. So you got the names, benefits. So you're not forced to do positional-based references like you used to be.
Yeah, but it's good to know that if you deconstruct it into a new tuple, which is really simple when you use the built-in language features, it could end up not being what you think it is.
Gotcha.
Cool. So I'm really excited about the null reference types coming.
Yep.
You want to talk about that?
Sure. So what's funny with nulls in C# and .NET in general is that I think that the developer who decided to add that to the language has probably have regretted that since the start. It's one of those things. I heard someone calculating on how many millions of dollars the null reference exceptions have cost over the years. And it's just a tremendous amount of money, right? So they want to find ways for developers to find null references before it goes into production.
Yeah, I think it also cost me my hair. So yeah, that's a good thing there.
It's costing people jobs and hairs, and it's an interesting language feature to have, right? And now that we get the null reference types, which is a way for us to declare that we no longer want nulls in our context. So what you can do is that you can say, inside my entire solution, inside my project, inside this class, inside this method, you can be very granular about how you want to treat nulls in your application. You can say that I don't want nulls anywhere, or I want nulls in this particular place. And what you say is that everything is now looked at as non-nullable, or it's looked at as nullable. So you can say that, for instance, all the strings which are normally nullable are no longer allowed to be null. And what happens when you compile your application is that you're going to get a warning to tell you that, hey, you should probably fix this because you might have a potential null reference problem.
Gotcha.
Now, in this upcoming version, they're going to treat that as warnings, I believe, is the final thing. But you can, of course, turn on warnings as errors, and that's going to break the build if you have potential null reference problems.
So the last thing that I read about C# 8 was that null reference types weren't going to be on by default. You would have to turn it on.
Yeah, that's correct. So it's still, I believe, a preview feature. So you have to turn that on. Or actually, it's a feature coming in Visual Studio 2019, and you have to opt in your project. That's correct.
Gotcha. Okay. So this isn't something you would suggest someone use on an existing project or something that's been around for years. Yeah.
Right. So putting the null reference types in existing projects would be a very interesting experiment, because you would definitely find places where nulls could end up being null reference exceptions.
Gotcha.
Now, going ahead and fixing all of those problems is probably not the best approach, because it might not be a real problem. But I know, I think John Skeet wrote a blog post on how he turned it on for Notatime, which is his open source project. I found heaps of interesting things on how it could potentially, crash and turn into null reference exceptions.
And if he's got those in his code, everyone has them in their code.
So I could see you like turning it on and then seeing what the list looks like, and maybe scan through it, but find some of the really bad ones and then turn it back off. But
you probably want to do that, or because So I've been building a lot of different projects over the years, and I normally tend to ignore the warnings, and I think a lot of developers do, right?
Right.
So you probably want to turn it on, try it out, and then fix the bigger ones, and then turn it on sometime in the future again, and try it a little bit on enough and see what works for you.
Do you think this will change how developers use C#? I mean, I know, right? It's going to take a while for people to start developing projects that can really make use of it. But do you see this becoming the standard in the next few years, that people are using this feature?
Yeah, I think so. So I've been doing Kotlin for work for a little bit over a year now, and everything's non-nullable by default. So you have to be very explicit about when you want something to be null, and you need to handle that properly. Otherwise, the compiler is going to slap you on the fingers. Yeah. And I think that most languages will turn into that. It'll allow you to use nulls over wherever you want, but you need to be very explicit about if it's null or not null.
Gotcha.
Right? Gotcha. I think that it would have been tough for the compiler team to just say, or to say that, let's just look at everything as non-nullable, and we're going to just give people errors everywhere.
Oh, yeah. No, that wouldn't
Then
work.
You wouldn't have any developers left, right?
Right.
That would have been terrible.
Yeah. So you mentioned pattern matching and how tuples can take advantage of the new pattern matching in C# 8. Yep. You're not talking like regex patterns. You're talking something else, right?
Yeah, right. So when we look at an object, we can now introduce something called a deconstructor or deconstruct.
Okay.
What this method will do, it'll take your type and deconstruct it into something else, which is a tuple. So it'll take your type and you imagine that it's a person, right? You have a name and you have an age.
Mm-hmm.
Then it would deconstruct your person type into an integer as well as a name. Does that make sense?
So in that sense, the pattern's built in. It's not even something you have to tell it to do. It's just automatically part of the tuple.
No, so that's part of the type. So on the person type, you introduce a method called deconstruct, which returns a tuple, or it sets. It's capable of setting a few values, which you then deconstruct into a tuple. It's hard to explain without looking at code. But basically, what you want to do is that you take your person type and you deconstruct that into a tuple that contains an integer and a string, which represents your age and your name, right?
Okay.
So then the way that we construct, or the way that we use that together with pattern matching, is that imagine that we look through a list of persons or a list of people.
Okay.
Now you want to introduce or find people where they have a given name or where they don't have a name specified at all. You want to select out the people without a name. You can use pattern matching to look at a given type and find that particular thing.
So instead of doing like an IEnumerable or iterating over a collection to find specific values.
You still need the IEnumerable to look over the entire collection.
Okay.
But when you match on that particular person, you can have a subclass of person, for instance, that would be a teacher, it could be a mechanic or whatever you want, right? So you can say, find me a mechanic that has a name specified. Okay. So you can use a switch expression to look through your particular types and match that against certain constructs of that particular class. Okay.
And you mentioned switch expression. There's a new switch inside of C# 8 that's
it's
simplified.
It works pretty much like the old switch. It's just simplified. It looks more like other programming languages.
Okay.
So it's much more like they want to introduce less code and they want to do expressions everywhere pretty much. And it's just a lot nicer.
Gotcha.
We can include some links to, I have an MSD, an article on pattern matching and how to do that in a really nice way in your applications. And we can include that as well in the links.
Yeah, that'd be great. So what are some of the different patterns then?
We mentioned the tuple pattern.
Right.
That'll allow you to say that given this particular type, let's say that we have the person, it could be subclassed into different types of people. And you can say that I want a particular mechanic with a given age or something like that. And then you can have a positional pattern. And you can have a positional pattern to say that I want the first value of the tuple to have some particular value. You could look at properties, which is the property pattern. So you can do a whole lot of interesting things, right? So you can use pattern matching to not only look at the particular type, but you can also look at the traits of that particular type. And then inside, let's say that you have your switch, and then you say, for the case of it being a person, or for the case of it being a mechanic, I want to use this mechanic inside this context. And you don't have to cast that to the particular type yourself.
Okay.
So some of these C# 8 features are going to be core only, and some are core and full framework. Do you know where that separation is?
So I believe that some of the features that you won't be seeing in full framework is the asynchronous streams will most likely not show up.
Right.
Whenever record types show up in .NET or C#, it's not going to be full framework. And the default interface methods, they won't be in full framework either.
Got you.
But I'm not sure about the other ones. It could be that some of them are available in full framework.
Got you. I'm actually seeing something here that it says async streams, indexers, ranges, all rely on framework types that are part of .NET standard, not necessarily framework or core. So that maybe that's the differentiator. Okay.
Yeah.
What's the thing in C# or .NET that you're getting the most bang for your buck or finding most useful currently? Are you using C# 8 in preview?
So I'm using C# 8 only for smaller hobby things. And I'm doing a little bit of .NET Core APIs as well on the side. But since C# 8 hasn't been officially released yet, it's hard to get that approved across the board of all the other developers and architects and all of that. But some of the things that I would like to introduce is, of course, the null reference types. I think that's going to be an interesting thing to add to the projects that we have. I see more and more developers moving across over to .NET Core. We've had heaps of .NET, older ASP.NET APIs, and we were migrating over to .NET Core. And I think it's going to open the door to just jump on .NET Core 3.0 and then or 3.1 and then introduce C# 8 as well. We're all going to be benefiting from the switch expressions and maybe not the default interface methods. If you've seen my talk, you probably know that I'm not really a fan of that feature, but it's an interesting feature to add to the language.
Yeah, I've been lucky to actually have been working with .NET Core since it went release candidate. So I'm looking forward to more developers moving onto Core and having access to the benefits that .NET Core and .NET Standard provide.
Yeah, I jumped on the on ASP.NET Core even before they called it Core. I think it was MVC 6 or whatever they called the testing version, and I tried to jump on early, and I got some projects to jump on the preview of that because I thought this is going to be the way forward. And then with each release, it just got harder and harder to keep upgrading to the new features, and it's. But now I think it's going to settle. So as people get onto .NET Core 2.0 and then onwards, it's going to be easier to migrate to newer versions as well.
This is a bit of a tangent, and after this we can get to picks. But we were actually talking with Mads Christensen about this, right? The early versions of .NET Core and DNX instead of .NET Command, and how all the config stuff ended up in JSON, and then it went back to being a mix. There were a lot of bumps along the road, so to speak, but I really like where it's ended up.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting with that is that they've been very transparent with all the work that they've done. And of course, people are going to hate them for moving in one direction, then moving over to another one, because people are used to Microsoft always releasing things when it's done. So in the early days of ASP.NET Core and .NET Core, people probably thought that this isn't going to change much and then jumped on the ship early. Mm-hmm. But then it started changing, and we see this kind of trend in Microsoft where they try to do more things in the open, get the feedback from the users early so they can change according to what people want. And I think that's better than just waiting 2 or 3 years before releasing a new version.
Agreed.
About 10 months before we started Ruby Rogues, which is the oldest podcast on devchat.tv, I went freelance. And one of the things that I figured out pretty fast is that I had no idea what I was doing. And I made a bunch of mistakes, but I also made a bunch of friends who were doing freelance, and we got together and we started a podcast called The Freelancer Show. And The Freelancer Show has been running about as long as JavaScript Jabber, but we talk every week about all of the things that we were learning and doing in freelancing and giving people advice on how to get their business started so that they could go out and be independent if that's what they wanted. Nowadays, I'm not on the show anymore, but we have terrific people like Reuven Lerner and Eric Dietrich that come on every week and talk to you about how they run their businesses and give other perspectives on things that you can do. So whether it's how to find clients or whether it's how to step in and start doing training or other programs or how to run a business, they have a ton of experience. And they talk about all kinds of things that are going to help you pull things together and be successful as a freelancer. So whether you're thinking about moonlighting and trying it out, or whether you're going whole hog and quitting your job, you should definitely check out The Freelancer Show. And you can find that at freelancershow.com.
So, Philip, at the end of each show, we like to, tell our listeners about something that we're interested in lately. Could be a movie, could be a book, could be food, anything technology related, anything like that. So if you can try to think of something, I'll have Caleb start with his pick this week.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So my pick, and it actually goes off of some of the discussion we had last week, Chuck, about Nintendo Switch is, they've come out with a new version of the Switch, not the Switch Lite, but the Switch that has better battery life and has the Tegra X1 built in. And GameStop is doing a deal right now where you can bring in your existing Switch and trade it in for a $225 credit towards a brand new one. And so that's something that I'm looking at doing because it goes from 2 to 4.5 hours of playtime to like 5 to 9. And you get a new Switch out of it for $75. So anyone who likes the Switch and plays a lot on the go, I think it's well worth it.
Cool. Chuck, do you have a pick?
I'm just going to pick a couple of episodes we did lately.
So Ruby Rogues, we talked to Adam Cuppy, and we talked a lot about building proficiency and good habits and things like that, which was really, really great. And then on Tuesday, I talked to Douglas Crockford, who's pretty well known in the JavaScript community. He wrote JavaScript for Good Parts and a few other books. And anyway, really, really enjoyed that. So I'm going to pick that as well. And then finally, I've been playing a game on my phone lately, just off and on when I'm kind of stuck somewhere and have a minute. And it's the Dr. Mario World that's on the iPhone. And that's been a lot of fun too. So pick those.
Okay. My pick this week is kind of on topic with what we kind of talked about today, with debugging, especially with async and await. And it's a Visual Studio plugin called Ozcode. I don't know if anybody that's here that's used it before, but they call themselves a magical debugger. So it really enhances that debugging capability that you get within Visual Studio and allows you to kind of filter things that you're looking at in your watched windows, much more advanced debugging tools for Visual Studio. So if you want that kind of ability, check out Ozcode.
I'll have to take a look.
All right. Philip, did you think of something?
Yeah, so my pick is they just announced that the Final Fantasy VIII remaster is going to be released next week. And it's going to be released for the Switch. So if you trade in your Switch and get a new one, you're probably going to have battery life enough to finish the game in a few days. Nice. So I'm really excited about that, as well as the Final Fantasy VII remake that they've been releasing demos off and showing off content. As you can probably say, that I'm a big Final Fantasy gamer, so I love that they're invested in the game as well. So I'm looking forward to spending some time playing that.
Yeah, I have versions of Final Fantasy across more platforms than I care to admit, including my phone.
Yep, I can relate to that.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Philip, for being with us today. If some of our listeners want to reach out to you, how could they do that?
They can ping me on Twitter. I'm at Ekberg on Twitter, or they can head over to my blog, filipekberg.se, or just shoot me an email. I'm happily answering questions about C# or programming or stuff in life in general.
And
thank you so much for being.
No, thank you. Thank you for joining us. I also understand you have a book, C# smorgasbord.
That's correct. Yeah, I do. And it's now freely available on its website. You can find that through my Twitter or through my blog as well. It's got a few years on its back, but it covers things like asynchronous programming and a lot of things that haven't changed over the years. So you can still pick that up and read through the book and find some good content. I'm biased, though. So you have to ask someone else, but yeah.
One last thing I also like to let our listeners know about is if they want to reach out and discuss with other listeners of any of the devchat.tv podcasts or with any of the hosts of the podcasts, go to devchat.tv and look at the top. You'll find option for chat. Click on that. It'll take you a Discord group for all the different podcasts that are available on devchat.tv. Thanks again, everybody, for being here today, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.